we can get going.
So I know we have more people that are probably planning on coming in, but Grace, I think it's true we can get going. And especially Gladys will be respectful of your time. So thank you all for coming. And we usually open our meetings with a land acknowledgement. My name is Sarah I'm from Community Organized for Solidarity and a Belmont resident. And Jennifer and Grace are going to be co-hosting. The three of us will co-host tonight. Jennifer Burgess and Grace McGathy also work with COS and with several other community organizations here in Belmont. But I think, Grace, that we usually start our meetings with a land acknowledgement. So I think, Grace, you're going to start us off with that.
Yes, so we would like to acknowledge that we are holding our meeting on stolen land. What we today call the state of Massachusetts and the town of Belmont are in fact the land of many peoples, including the Pequoiset, the Mohican, and the Wampanoag. These people are living today, and we must honor and celebrate their history and their contributions through listening to and working with Indigenous leaders to combat the colonial and settler violence that is perpetuated today. Let's start by committing to support Belmont's Change the Name campaign. Many COS members and neighbors stood out in support of this effort tonight to change Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day. So thank you.
And thank you to Stephanie Kremen, who's worked so hard to get that started. And it's exciting because in May we get to vote on it as a community. So thank you for all your work, Stephanie. And I apologize, I think my children are in the background. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Grace. And this evening we're so excited to have Gladys Vega of Colaborativa, Georgia Green of Chelsea PACT, and Marian Ryan, Middlesex DA with us. But before we begin, we would like to acknowledge that this is a panel that we had hoped to hold on the 24th of March, and that at the beginning of that evening, we had intended to hold a moment of silence to recognize the death of women who had been recently murdered in Atlanta, Georgia. And now this evening, as we join together, we need to not only commemorate and reflect on their passing, but also on the recent murder of Daunte Wright in Minnesota and the trial that's ongoing for George Floyd, and of course Derek Chauvin's trial. So Jennifer, I think you're going to lead us in a reflection and a moment of silence. Go ahead.
Yeah, Kim was not able to be here. I wanted to kind of read what she had written to honor her for, unfortunately she had a conflicting event. So she said, I would like to have a moment of silence for the victims of the recent mass shootings in Atlanta and in Boulder. In March 2021 alone, we have had 7 mass shootings in America, 7 within the past 24 days. Now this was written for the 24th. While the focus of the recent shootings will once again force a conversation on gun control, I believe there are major underlying issues that speak to misogyny, immigration status, and class inequities. All too often, women are, underpaid. All too often, women are underpaid and victims of human trafficking, forced into sex work without having the protection of the law. As advocates, it is our job to ensure that all women are protected under the law, regardless of immigration status. We are privileged to have such an esteemed panel of women joining us tonight. With that, I would like to take a moment of silence for those folks that we've lost that I have just named, and for Daunte Wright, who was a victim of state-sanctioned lynching. So we'll just take a moment. Thank you. So, Sarah, next up, I think I'm introducing our speakers. I've got a lot to read. So, first up is Gladys Vega, who is the Executive Director of La Colaborativa, formerly known as the Chelsea Collaborative. Gladys has dedicated 30 years of service to the city of Chelsea, and she joined the Chelsea Collaborative in 1990, 2 years after its founding. She took on increasing responsibility and went from the receptionist to a community organizer to assistant executive director, ultimately becoming the executive director in 2006. She has worked as an organizer and advocate to ensure that the Latino community has a role in determining the ways in its needs and concerns are addressed. She believes that empowerment of individuals lead to empowerment of the community, and that social action is the vehicle and empowered community can use to achieve its goals. She's the architect of most of the Collaborative's community coalitions. She has been a leader and played the leadership role in organizing for immigrant rights, welfare rights, tenants' rights, open space and the environment, cultural and anti-racism programs, and in numerous grassroots campaigns. She is not only a successful community organizer, but also one of Chelsea's most prominent and important community leaders, receiving citywide, statewide, and national accolades. In 2007, she led the Chelsea City Council to make Chelsea Massachusetts' third sanctuary city. As a founding member of Centro Latino, the only direct service for Latinos in Chelsea at the time, she served as board president of the organization for 5 years. She also served on the Board of Health, United Way Committee, as a Democratic delegate for the National Convention in 2000. In 2007 and 2008, she was named as one of Massachusetts' top 100 most influential leaders. She's been a guest speaker at UMass, Boston, MIT, Salem State of Social Work, School of Social Work, Boston University School of Social Work, Boston University Law School, numerous national conferences. And Gladys was born in Puerto Rico and came to Chelsea with her family at the age of 9. Since that time, she's made a lifelong commitment to the community in which she was raised. Being a mother of 2 has deepened her commitment to building a better future. So we welcome Gladys. Next, we have Georgia. Georgia Green has been a clinical social worker for over 30 years at Massachusetts General Hospital, Chelsea Health Center, Behavioral Health Department, and provides outpatient therapy to adults and children. She also works in collaboration with the Chelsea Police Department and an MGH-funded program called the Chelsea Police Action Counseling Team, or PACT. Georgia has been involved with PACT for more than 20 years, where she works both directly with Chelsea families that have had interactions with the police and also provides training to officers about the effects of trauma on children, officers' unique role in helping children, and trauma-informed interactions with children and victims of crime. So thank you, Georgia, for being here, and we'd like to welcome Georgia. And last, but certainly not least, DA Marian Ryan was elected to office in 2014 as the Middlesex County District Attorney, which represents the Commonwealth's largest county with 54 towns and cities and 21 colleges in urban, suburban, and rural areas, comprising over 1/4 of the population of Massachusetts. From her experience, she's learned that as important as prosecution is, prevention is equally as important and leads to a better outcome. She's a recognized expert on developing and creating innovative solutions that are defined not simply getting involved after a criminal act has occurred, but instead taking meaningful steps to stop for it. She has been a leader in domestic violence prevention and prosecution throughout her career and has conducted trainings across the country for prosecutors, law enforcement officers, and service providers on recognizing the signs of domestic violence. District DA Ryan is committed through her volunteer work with the Women's Bar Foundation to mentoring women lawyers and law students as they begin their legal careers. She grew up in Somerville and is a summa cum laude graduate of Emmanuel College and a cum laude graduate of Boston College Law School. So we would like to welcome all of you and thank you so much for being here. And so we're going to start with Gladys for 15 to 20 minutes to talk a little bit about what your involvement in Chelsea and what you're doing around immigration, advocacy for women, legislation and reform that improves the quality of life for these residents, and the advocacy that you're doing. So
and
Gladys,
real quick, I just want to also invite the audience members to put questions in the chat throughout, and we'll call on folks towards the end to ask their questions. Thank you.
Okay, so should I start now?
Yes, please.
Okay. So thank you for having me. I grew up in Chelsea. Chelsea is the only city that I know. If you take me out of here, I'll get lost. I have made this community my home. I came from a single mom who was an alcoholic, but she raised me with incredible values. And one of the values that I always carry is that we don't choose our country of origin. That is why we need to get to know everyone and try to make path to allow other people. And I think that also she value a lot the diversity. Early age, I was in a classroom at the age of 9 with people from Honduras. They were moving from Central America here because of the Civil War. And then, these are the friends that I had kept through decades in my life as friends and as members of my community. I would have to say that one of the things that I wanted, because of the times that we're in and the situations that we're living in, I always stand in the side of, the women from the Asian community, the indigenous families that continue to be neglected and ignored when they were the first one in this amazing country, this great land of opportunity. Our African-American colleagues and friends who have been sort of like violently targeted. And I think that in my work in Chelsea, some of you may not know that I worked very hard 27 years ago by bringing the criminal justice system in Chelsea, as our police department was using force in order to arrest non-English speakers. And for me, it was a time that there was only one police officer, and that police officer was responsible for every Latino that had an issue in our community. And I made it a point back then to bring the criminal justice system because we documented police brutality issues back then. And what we did, in addition to bringing the criminal justice system, we make sure that the police department did have no excuses in hiring our own people. When the criminal justice department finished their investigation, the former chief of police back then resigned from his post. And then at that time, there was a federal grant called Weed and See, and that immediately allowed the city of Chelsea to get monies to weed out the criminals, supposedly, right? And see new people. So what we did, we seeded new people, we diversified the Chelsea Police Department. We had one police officer. Today we're numbers 2 in Massachusetts in terms of diversity and people from our community that are police officers. And, for you during these times, that may be difficult, but it has paid a good price for us because these are the same police officers that their mom may be undocumented. These are the same police officers that their brother may be in the streets doing something wrong and they're trying to rescue them and take them out of opiums, etc. And what I made in Chelsea with the chief of police, Chief Kais, is the relationship that when we see anything wrong, we have his cell phone, we call them up. He tells me, let me investigate, I'll get back to you. And then when he investigates, I make him come to the community meeting and say how he reprimanded whoever he was supposed to reprimand. I mean, I remember vividly when the Ferguson case happened, Chelsea, Massachusetts had a Latino police officer that when he was arresting a guy, he punched him in the nose. And that was the same day that the Ferguson was happening, the case in Ferguson. And I was devastated because I was like, oh my gosh, Chelsea's going to be our next Ferguson. And I said to the chief, before this information leaks, what are your plans to let go Mr. Felix Rivera? That was the name of the police officer. And I name him just because we name community members that are so-called criminal, but we never called or name or remember the name of a police officer that does wrong. So it's my business to always name him, because even if he was Latino, he did something wrong in my community. So anyway, so we got together and he said, don't worry about it. He made a promise to the community in a town hall meeting. When the investigation finishes, he would let him go. He was let go with no pay and then completely fired. And for me, the fact that we are constantly bringing the chiefs of police to the table, when we see something wrong, when they act wrong, we call them, but also I praise them when they do something right. And I think what has worked for Chelsea is that our police officers are young people that I pulled from the Summer Youth Employment Program. We have a junior academy, and when the junior academy, you know, the guys turn 18 and they're in the junior academy, we tell them within 2.5 more years, you can become a police officer within your city. So anyway, so we've been recruiting from that police junior academy from the Summer Youth Employment Program, a program that now is being run by Chelsea Police Department. And we contribute with our youth. But those are the things that I've been able to do. Also, you know, I am a whistleblower. I feel that I'm responsible, that when I see an injustice, that I call it. I don't tolerate like that lack of, I give myself a lot of responsibility for whatever I see wrong to call it, because if we let it go, that institutional racism or those mannerisms continue to happen, and people laugh about it and then become part of the furniture. And then we're contributing to this type of oppression that is getting to a moment in time that is much worse. I think that in this past year during the pandemic, right, we've been doing so much work in tireless hours. My shifts are usually 16-hour days, right, a day hours. And I come home and I sleep for 4 hours and begin to do it all over again. But I saw a lot of sort of like issues with females being in situations of domestic violence. And I think it's because they have spent so much with their abuser in their home. The abuser may not be making any money, and the restrictions of the lack of financial means have made situations much worse. And we have to be placing females in local shelters or in transitional housing, because at times our local shelters that are for domestic violence take females as far as Rhode Island, because there's not that many shelters that allow for undocumented women to be part of the shelter system. So we have worked very hard to see how can we provide transitional housing for these females, and work with our local Harbor Cove to make sure that they get the immediate resources and services. We also are transitioning a lot of people in as they're getting evicted. So in our food pantry, we use the food pantry as a lifeline, as an excuse to make sure that while people are looking for food, we're telling them, hey, if you're facing an eviction, if you need help with rental assistance, we've been providing $700,000 in cash assistance, a little bit more than that. I just got $100,000. I just got the check to cash. So we are trying everything that is possible in order for us to make it work in our community. But I tell you, the stuff that we see in Chelsea, in this quiet Latino low-income community, it's painful. At times, it's you go home and you don't disconnect, and you immediately think about, if I don't resolve this issue within 2 days, what am I going to do with this family? Where these 3 little girls under the age of 5 are going to go with their mom? And those are the situations that we are dealing with. But I tell you, God has been good. The Commonwealth has been extremely good in terms of supporting our work, and also our partners. We have incredible partners in Chelsea, such as MGH, the Chelsea Police Department, TND. All of our friends have been very helpful, but we're still struggling. But we have a group of amazing individuals that are every day working as hard as I am to make it happen in Chelsea. But the wrath or the aftermath of the pandemic is not yet over, and it will not soon be over. We have years to come for us to be able to see people full-time working, people sustaining themselves. In the meantime, we're trying to do band-aid work, which is not sustainable. So a lot of people say, Gladys, you're doing amazing work. And in my mind and in my heart, I wish that would be true. For me, amazing work is to be able to sustain a family long-term and not a band-aid, transitional housing for 3 months, 6 months. And my family tells me, Gladys, at least they're not, in the hallway, you took them out of a car, but still the responsibility and of not having permanent housing remains very concerning for our families in Chelsea. Immigration remains a big issue. The wave of immigrants from Central America are beginning to come more as 2014, which we had a huge wave of undocumented, unaccompanied minors. We are beginning, Yesenia Alfaro, who does my immigration work, has beginning to see a growth in that. So we're, staying tuned and seeing how we're going to manage that. But I'm delighted to be here with this amazing group of females. And let's continue to work together to make sure that our community have access to real justice, because I really think access to justice, but it has to be real. It has to be of people that really know what they're doing and that they care about the human race and not the colors. Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you so much, Gladys. Like Grace said, if you have any questions for Gladys about anything that she asked, I know my first question is how people from outside of Chelsea can assist. You can write them in the chat, and if Gladys, you have to go, that's fine. I can email them and get answers from you, and Georgia and DA Ryan can assist as well.
So, okay, so I just have to tell you, I have to go just because I'm in a toilet sitting here. This is my only quiet space. and people are going to begin to use it and knock on the doors. So
talk about dedication, Gladys. You were the best. Thank you so much.
Sorry about my toilet paper in my head. I was covering. I did good while I was presenting.
Very, very good.
Ciao. Take care.
Bye, Gladys.
Bye-bye. Gracias. Ciao. Bye-bye.
So Sarah, do you want to, I don't know, do you want me to introduce our next speaker? Is Georgia, to talk about your work and what you're doing.
Great. Well, I think as I was introduced earlier, I'm a clinical social worker at MGH in Chelsea. I first came to Chelsea as an intern 1,000 years ago. I'm not even going to say how long ago it was, and fell in love with Chelsea and have had a love affair with Chelsea ever since. And so in some ways, I think Gladys and I are both, on the Yay Chelsea train tonight. But it is a wonderful community. And though I started out doing outpatient mental health and seeing families and children and whatever, just in the regular clinic in Chelsea, I had the opportunity about 22 years ago. I was asked to be part of a new program that was a collaboration with the Chelsea Police Department. And actually my boss at the time had said, Georgia, nobody wants to do this thing, but I'm going to ask you to please do this. We need somebody to do this. And I know you've worked in a prison before, so maybe you could do it. So that's how I got the job. And the program was what we call now the PACT program, Police Action Counseling Team. And I'll say a little bit about how it got started. Marian may know even more about this than I do in terms of there having been a law passed in the late 90s where large hospitals who served many, many, many people and made profits needed to give back a certain proportion of their revenue to underserved communities that they serve. So Mass General is a huge hospital, and there are many community health centers, Revere, the North End, Chelsea, every place. And so what they did at the time was to have focus groups, and they asked people in Revere to have focus groups and decide how they would like Mass General to spend the money in their community. They did the same in Everett and the same in Chelsea and whatever. And so in Chelsea at the time, and again, this is the late 90s, people were particularly concerned about youth violence and the amount of crime that children were exposed to, and they wanted some kind of a program to address those concerns. The chief of police at the time in Chelsea was Chief Flynn, and he had heard about a program down in New Haven, Connecticut, that was a collaboration between the Yale Child Study Center and the New Haven Police Department. And he really liked it, and he thought that that would be a way that MGH could spend their money in Chelsea. So as it turned out, that's what happened. And there were originally 3 clinicians, myself, a psychologist, and another social worker, and 4 police officers. One was a lieutenant, one was a detective, one was a patrol officer, and one was a sergeant. And the 7 of us went down to New Haven, and we spent a week with the Yale Child Study Center clinicians and the New Haven Police Department. We did ride-alongs with the police down there, and we had groups that were seminars and discussions and whatever. And they basically shared with us kind of how they run the model of this program in New Haven. And New Haven is, in some ways, in riding around, feels a little bit like Chelsea in some ways. It has some, some very devastated areas and a lot of boarded up places and whatever, a lot of poverty, and all around the mecca of Yale University, which is very wealthy and doing well. But anyway, it's a much, much larger community than Chelsea. I would say that they probably have about 7 times more police officers in New Haven than we have in Chelsea. And we have a lot of police officers in Chelsea. So the 7 of us then came back to Chelsea after that week and tried to figure out how we could work a model like that in Chelsea, it being a smaller community and a different community in many ways than New Haven. And so the next 22 years have been spent doing that. And how the program works, I'll say a little bit about that, is that, well, I'll say a little bit about the funding. MGH and some grants initially funded our program probably for about the first 3 years. And then Mass General, through the money that they set aside to go into the communities, paid for the entire program for several years, from probably the early 2000s until 2012, paid for 3 clinicians, myself and the 2 other clinicians, and our beepers and our overnight coverage that we did for the police department. And we did that for quite a long time. Our funding was cut in 2012 just because they were funding a whole bunch of other things. And so it went from 3 clinicians to me clinician. And so I'm basically doing all of that at this point. Not that there's a lot of less crime, but anyway, let that go as it may. But how the program works is that the police officers have all been trained. There's like 107 police officers from their top down, from Chief Kais down to the newest patrol officer. And we cover 1.8 square miles with 107 officers. So that is a lot of officers. And every single one of those officers has had training on what the PACT program is and why it exists and why it's important to pay attention to. Focused on children being exposed to violence, being victims of violence, or witnessing violence. So when any police officer goes to any 911 call and there are children present who are either victims of violence, have witnessed violence, or somehow been exposed to violence, that officer in the past would page us, now emails me with the information about the report. I get the report, I review the report, and I make contact with the family. And all of the services through my program are voluntary. Nobody has to do it. It's a free service, and we do it for the benefit of children in the community and for the future of those children. So that's what happens. And I respond to the family. I would say most of the time, no matter what terrible thing has happened, parents are very grateful for anything that helps their children. And they're often very open to talking with me or letting me come to the home or bringing the whole crew into the clinic. During COVID, it's been very challenging because I do those calls on Zoom, and I do them when I have an interpreter for a parent, and it's a little complicated, but it works. And so what I do with the family is that I do a little intervention with the kids with some artwork and drawing at the beginning and to get to know the children. And then I read a story to the kids and engage them in the story, helping them point out things as I'm reading along, which educates both parents and children a little bit about the possible effects of negative effects of violence or witnessing violence. And it sort of teaches parents to be on the lookout for the fact that a child might look fine and say that they're fine, but not be fine. And that it really teaches parents and children to be aware of how behavioral changes can be children's way of telling parents that all is not well. A kid might, for example, start wetting the bed after, some horrible thing has happened, or a child might have trouble sleeping, refusing to eat, or eating everything in sight as comfort food to try to feel better. Children who cling to parents and are afraid that something else is going to happen. Kids that are afraid to go out because they need to stay home and protect mom. All kinds of symptoms like that. And so it's a way of really educating families, kids and their parents, about some of the negative effects of seeing violence and witnessing violence in any way, shape, or form. And I also do a little, we have a discussion between the parent and the children to help it be something that they can talk about and not have to shove under the rug and pretend didn't happen, but in a way that feels okay for everybody. I also teach a little bit of a relaxation, some breathing exercises to help children and parents to stay calm. And I make sure that the parent is involved because I might be with this family for an hour with this information, but the more people that hear it in the family, and especially the parent, is going to be with that family for the other 23 hours every day. And so hopefully that information can be disseminated, not just to the children, but to everybody in the family. So that's one of the things that happens. I do that with the kids. Sometimes that you can assess there may be an issue that's not addressed. There may be a safety issue going on in the home. It might be somebody who says, the thing that would make me feel safer is if we could get our locks changed tonight. Okay, let's see what we can do about getting the locks changed. If, I've had kids say, I'm scared here all the time, and the rats in the wall that run at night keep me awake. Okay, let's get an exterminator in there and do something about that. That's not okay. If people aren't safe at home, can we hook them up with a number or a shelter where they can get some help with that? We often make referrals to a Haven program at Mass General, which is for domestic violence survivors, or to Harbor Cove, which Gladys mentioned, which is an awesome resource in Chelsea. And we do whatever we can to provide people with extra services. We might send them to like Colaborativa. We work very closely with Department of Children and Families as well. And every week we have a meeting at the police station. Now it's on Zoom, of course, with Captain Tom Dunn, he was one of the original 7 people 22 years ago with me who started this program in Chelsea. He's there. Grace is there from Department of Children and Families, and I'm there, and we review all the cases that happened, the previous week. As often there are 51As filed at the same time that I might be called in to see a family or to help with the kind of the psychological piece of what's going on. So we review those cases. And I think that one of the other functions of my role with the police department is to do ongoing training with the police, whenever, not only did we train everybody initially when this program started, but we refreshed that periodically during the trainings. And every new hire that comes in from the police academy does a training with Captain Dunn and myself. And we train about the PACT program and how it works and how they need to refer to it. We talk about the protection of children who don't have voices and can't speak for themselves in dangerous situations and involving DCF when it's appropriate. We talk about a little bit about child development. It's often a good hook for officers because officers have children. And so they're interested in those kinds of things. And I think one of the most important things is to help them use the power that they have as a uniformed police officer, not just for, being frightening in the community, but for being able to connect with people in the community. And especially to be able to connect with children. I think to help a police officer appreciate the power that they have to make a difference for a child is enormous, and it is hugely enormous. And it also is a way of ensuring that officer safety. I think, for example, when an officer, can make a positive intervention and connection with a 4-year-old, that same kid in the community when he's 14 and he may be starting to, run into a little problem here or there, to know a police officer is a really good thing. And for the kids in the community to know who the police officers are, to know that they can come to them to be safe or to get help is way better than those same kids being afraid and staying away from the police and seeing the police as enemies. So we really, that's a huge part of the training and to help them be important to children. And I think it's something that is rewarding for police officers as well. I often give feedback. I email back and say, thank you for that referral at such and such an address. I saw those kids and I saw the parents and, we were able to do X, Y, and Z, and the mom now has childcare for the little one. She got a restraining order. She's getting some services right now. And I think what's good for them is it helps them to feel like they don't leave devastating situations with children a mess and feel helpless and not being able to do good. I think it helps them feel better about their job, that they're doing things that people appreciate, because very often police officers are called for terrible things. And they show up and people are not happy to see them, and somebody gets arrested, and it's not a happy job in a lot of ways. And I think when police officers can see the impact that they have on children, especially, and on people in the community, it really helps them feel good about their job and, get some rewards from it. So I always look at it as every interaction that I have with a police officer about a case or anything else is an opportunity for me to teach something or share something or praise them for something that they did that was really good. And there are a lot of those things in Chelsea. A lot of officers do some above and beyond for the people in that community. And to continue the teaching in that way, in that sort of one-to-one kind of way, in addition to doing the more structured training programs. I would like to say that in the 22 years that I've been working with the Chelsea PD, things have changed a lot. And I smiled as I was listening to Gladys talk about this. When I started in Chelsea many years ago, the police at the time were not real happy about the idea of having 3 clinicians doing ride-alongs, having a new program and whatever. And most of the officers were white male officers. And I can say now, 22 years later, I can walk in there anytime, ask somebody for something and they want to do it, they want to help. They call me at home if there's something like, Georgia, can you help with this situation? We had this situation, this kid really needs something, can you do something? So I think that the cross training and the collaboration from very different points of view, I think has paid off over the years. The officers now look like the community. There are many, many Hispanic officers. There are many more female officers. There's a couple of Asian officers, a Muslim officer. It is truly a very multicultural police force, and the people who are our police officers went to school with everybody in Chelsea. They know everybody, and they know the families already, and they want to do good things for their community and for the people that they know. And I think it's why I'm a huge fan of the Chelsea PD these days, in case you couldn't tell. But they have been wonderful. It's probably been the most rewarding part of my work career ever, is working with them. I never expected that that's the way it was going to turn out, but that's the way it has turned out. And it's all about, it started with the idea of helping children. I think that as a result of the program, I think that we've also made the police a little bit more open to other community agencies being involved with them. Since we wouldn't go away back in the day, even though they were sort of grumpy with us and whatever, we wouldn't go away. We kept going in, we kept doing the work, we kept talking to them, we kept doing the ride-alongs. We just didn't stop coming. And since then, they've had programs with ROCA in the city. They have a hub program now, which is an interdisciplinary multi-agency meeting once a week that meets at the police station. There are many more people from the community coming in and out and having meetings at the police station. And I think that makes for not only a wonderful police department, but I think one that can truly help every citizen, not just bad guys or people that they're arresting, but that helps children and that helps women in horrible, violent situations, which there are too many of. And it's what makes the community safer. The last thing I'll say is, I don't want to take too much time here, but the last thing I'll say is that, the kinds of incidents that I get called on are things like, it could be a car accident where a child sees a horrible thing, with a family member hitting the windshield or getting hurt themselves, falling out of a 5th-story window, which happens at least once a summer, or seeing street violence, seeing someone be shot in the street, or seeing some terrible thing. But of all of these awful things that have happened, probably the huge, biggest piece of the work that we have is interpersonal violence, domestic violence. And kids grow up in that, and they see it not once, they see it regularly. And as we know from the ACE studies from Kaiser Permanente, the kinds of things that our kids are seeing in Chelsea and pretty much everywhere are, the things that we see: the domestic violence, a parent with a substance problem, a parent with a mental illness, poverty, not enough food, food insecurity, housing insecurity, and all of the things that we deal with. And so I think that being able to address some of these things, not just in one agency here and one agency there, but as a complete community and backed with the safety of the police department, is probably as good as it gets. And I've just been enormously pleased and proud to work with the police in Chelsea for many years, and to work as closely as I do with DCF, with not just Grace, but all the people that have been in our program before her. And so with that, I will just end and open to any questions anybody might have.
Thank you so much. That is a lot of incredible, incredible work. So yeah, again, questions can go in the chat. I'm gonna just give it to DA Ryan, and then we can have more of a discussion with questions at the end. But yeah, so yes, welcome, DA Ryan.
Thanks, Jennifer. It's a very humbling experience to follow Georgia and Gladys. And I hope people think about the people that you don't see every day, who year after year are out there doing that. They're too modest to say that, but in kids whose lives are significantly better because of the work they've been doing. So we owe a great debt of gratitude to them and to the folks that do that work. I'm going to talk about sort of a different aspect of that. And And I'll sort of give you a little bit of the background. I know we originally planned this panel to talk about women's history. And in lots of ways, the reason I'm able to do this is sort of reverse women's history. When I was graduating from law school, which, as I like to remind people, was not when the dinosaurs were roaming the earth, what I really wanted to do was to go to a prosecutor's office and be able to try really serious cases like murders and those kinds of cases that, you know, we watch on TV. And in Massachusetts, the only office that would permit a woman to try a homicide case, because it was considered not really okay for them to do that, was Middlesex. So that's what brought me there. And when I got there, they were happy to let me try really serious cases, but they really just wanted that to be the cases that were domestics or where children had been hurt or killed, because nobody really liked doing that stuff either. So it was, despite the tragedy of it, an opportunity for me to really see what is, unfortunately, and it continues to be the main part of our business. You know, this is an enormous county, and across all of our criminal cases, it is the case that at least 75 to 80% of the victims in those cases are women and children. Yep. But what I learned from that was, and I say this all the time, you know, nobody ever wants to meet the DA's office. If you get in contact with the DA's office, it's for one of three things. Something has happened to you or somebody in your family. You were unfortunate enough to be in a place where you saw something that nobody should see, and now we want you to come talk about it. Or you or your family has been accused of a crime. And it didn't take me a long time to learn a lot of the things which really have motivated the way we work now, which was, number one, we are not a business that should be a growth industry with repeat customers. And I wasn't in the DA's office very long before I was seeing the children, and now sometimes the grandchildren, of people who either were victimized or were accused in cases I had prosecuted before. So that's not really a success when that's what we're seeing. And a piece of that was because I really believe, as the district attorney, you know, when a case is brought, a criminal case, it's the Commonwealth versus whoever's accused. And it's my responsibility to be the district attorney for the 1.6 million people in Middlesex County. And it doesn't really matter which side of that V you're on. And that was something we really didn't have a clear view on 20 years ago. And the other piece of it was, when you're doing that, we are the ultimate power who can take people's liberty away. When you're doing that, you have to be willing to look at yourself very critically. You have to be willing to say, which I don't think is a very revolutionary thing, this is a human system. In every human system, medicine, teaching, airplane pilots, whatever it is, even the best intentioned people sometimes do things wrong and you get to a bad result. It would be foolish not to think that in the criminal justice system that doesn't happen as well. I mean, one of the first things I did upon becoming DA was to create a conviction integrity program in our office, which was 7.5 years ago, was revolutionary. And how could we not think that mistakes happen? How could we not want to look hard at what had happened? Because everything about the justice system has been offended when there's a mistake. Because not only is the wrong person been incarcerated, but the person who did something is never held on. You know, we never had a real view of that was our job. And the other piece is, we have 54 police departments across Middlesex County, and we're fortunate in the quality of people there for the most part, but it also, although we work closely with them and they are our law enforcement partners, and as Georgia says, there are amazing things that happen there all the time, we also have to be accountable for the justice piece of what's happening. And that requires things like having the Brady list, a list where people who have abused the power they have are called out for that. As Gladys said, you know, you can go look up somebody's criminal case. Well, you can go to my website and see the people who are on the Brady list. And that is as it should be. Nobody wants to be in either of those categories, but one category should not be different than another. And another piece was, and one of the things that I want to talk just a little bit about immigration, and Gladys was a big partner with us on this, and is we have the district attorney's office has to, in many ways, not just around misconduct, but about what's the right result. Sometimes, and this is a hard thing to do, separate ourselves from other governmental agencies. And, you know, one of the things that has been the most important part of our work over the last few years is the lawsuit that we filed against ICE regarding people being able to take people from the courthouse. And, you know, as with everything, it starts with a very personal experience. And in 2016, we had a fire up in Lowell, and it was, as unfortunately has been happening in the last few months, you've probably seen on the news, in Lowell, we have lots of big wooden balloon constructed buildings. When they go up in a second. And they are big apartment buildings that might have 12, 14 apartments. There's often a lot of people living in that building. And we had one of those buildings go on fire about 3:30, 4 o'clock in the morning. And it was in a fairly nice section of the city where there's not a lot of traffic at night. That building was packed with people. Every apartment had a lot of people in it. And ultimately, there was a woman across the street who was going to work at about 20 after 4. And she saw the smoke coming out of that building. And she did two things. She called the police and she ran through the building, banging on doors and waking people up. And tragically, a little boy died in that fire. But there is absolutely no question. Everybody was asleep. There was no question that dozens of people would have died in that building, but for what she did. So I don't know that I would run into a building where black smoke was pouring out and that the fire was spreading pretty quickly. She should have been celebrated. When we spoke to that woman to have her describe the timing and all of that, the biggest fear for her was that she was undocumented and that somehow, some way, ICE would track that phone call that she had placed to 911. And her bigger concern was not just that she was undocumented, but she had come with a couple of her kids, and her family, which was of mixed status, had taken her in. And her concern was that she would bring ICE to their door. And I drove home that day thinking, this is just crazy. No matter what you think about immigration or how people should come or go or whatever, first of all, we're responsible for this woman while she's here. And she did what many of us would not be brave enough to do. And her biggest concern is, am I going to get sent from this country? And that very quickly, that was in 2016, and very quickly that segued into us seeing people who were afraid to come to court for any reason because ICE was hanging out in the courtroom. And if you've ever been in a district court, there's a list that hangs on the wall every morning that if you show up, you look where your case is and it tells you where to go. Well, the law at that point was that ICE had the right to come to the courthouse if they were looking for me and they knew I was going to be there. They could come and look for me. Well, the courthouse was a pretty good place for them to pick people up because the people had already walked through a metal detector and they felt like it would be pretty safe to take them. So it didn't take very long after 2016 for when the ICE agents came to stand looking at that list with their phone and plugging in the name of everybody else who might have been there. So they came looking for me, but your name is also on that list. And you happen to be somebody that also has an ICE issue. So they would sit around and just round people up. And if they weren't, even if somehow the court told them to leave, they stood outside on the front steps, and you could almost hear it ripple through the community that the people in the yellow jackets with the big ICE letters on the back, it wasn't subtle, were standing on the sidewalk. So now you had people, first of all, who might be victimized. You know, as Georgia said, lots of times they were being victimized. They weren't safe at home, and they couldn't go to court to get a restraining order or whatever they needed because they were afraid of getting picked up by ICE. And also, and people forget about this, you know, if my partner is abusing me, maybe I want him or her out of the house, and I don't want them to do that. I don't necessarily want them sent back to a country that we fled because we might have died, because whatever else, that person is still the parent of my children. So they weren't coming. When we needed people like the witness at the fire to come be a witness, they weren't coming. And if you were somebody who had a case on because you were accused of a crime, should I let a default warrant enter against me, or should I get deported? I think I'll take the default warrant. But then when you're driving, oh, and let's forget, like, you can't have a license, and you get stopped, and then there's a default warrant, you're getting taken to jail. There's nothing about that that is what America is about. We tell people that you go to a courthouse for protection, and that doesn't even start with, throughout this pandemic, think about how many people needed to get some kind of guardianship over a sick relative, who needed to get custody of their sister who just died of COVID, her kids. There's a million reasons that you need to go to court that have nothing to do with you being involved in a criminal activity. And ICE was just picking them up while they were there. And that's just wrong. And it was clear that they were amping up what they were going to be doing. So we partnered with Gladys, ultimately with the Suffolk DA's office, and we were very fortunate that a law firm in Boston, because filing a federal lawsuit costs a lot of money, a firm in Boston agreed to represent us for free when we had about a snowball's chance in hell of actually getting that policy changed, and sought, we filed our federal lawsuit, and at the same time, right, so the lawsuit's going to take, I don't know, never mind, even without the pandemic, probably 3 years. But in the meantime, if you get deported, your remedy is what if we win the lawsuit? They're not sending you back. So we asked the court for an injunction ordering ICE, and the standard for that is that what is happening is so irreparable and will happen over the pendency of the lawsuit, and we have a likelihood of success. So please stop it while the lawsuit goes along. We asked for that preliminary injunction, and ICE was basically laughing at us because they were sure we would never get that. And the risk was high, because when I decided to file that lawsuit, if we didn't get that injunction, they weren't coming for me. But ICE was going to be fired up, and it was clear to me that they would be standing at every Middlesex courthouse every day taking people. But it was either take what's there or do something else. So we filed that lawsuit, and the judge granted that preliminary injunction. And it was the first in the country stop and say that while people are on the way to court, while they are in court, and while they're on their way from court, they are not subject to being picked up by ICE. You know, if you want to drive off and go do your grocery shopping on your way home, that's fair game for ICE. But you had the constitutional right to be able to come and go to court to do that. And I think probably it was amazing to be able to do that and to be able to say to people who said, I'm afraid to come to court, you can't get picked up while you come to court. But probably the most moving part of that is we discovered, and Gladys and I did this together, was we discovered, even though we had gotten the injunction, that lots of people in the communities that were undocumented didn't know about it or didn't really understand what it meant or didn't believe. And remember, they're coming from countries where I'm here from the government to help you is even more ludicrous than the joke we make here, that they couldn't believe that people wouldn't still take them. So we began a program with state legislators and police departments going to communities. And you forget the complexity of this. We could only meet in places that were churches or schools and sanctuary places because people were afraid they would be taken while we were meeting. And I think probably for all of us, the most moving part was to see the people who are kind of the leaders who did understand about the injunction, who were carrying laminated copies of the injunction in their wallet because they knew that was a way for them to be safe doing what they needed to be doing. And, you know, it's a separation from law enforcement. Obviously, ICE is not happy with us. And what has been fascinating is, even though while we had the injunction for about a year and 3 quarters, they couldn't take anyone. And then at some point, the court in Boston, a number of appointees from another administration had made clear that we were probably not going to prevail on the lawsuit itself. And at that point, it sort of became a race to getting to last November and really to January. And we were able to get the judge to give us a little more time and a little more time to get ourselves to January. What has been really interesting, I think all of us thought we would get to January 20th and everything would reverse itself. And what we discovered is that the Justice Department is like the Titanic. It's hard to move. And ICE has not changed that policy. We continue to be protected in Massachusetts because of the injunction, because the ICE immigration policies remain largely in effect. I think it will change. It's going to take a long time to do that. And so that injunction has become even more important because we thought we were buying time to the next administration. We have needed to have that going through all of this. So that is a big piece of where we are. It's also been important for us to figure out, and the community meetings were another example of it. All along, when I first started thinking about a lot of our domestic violence or our kids initiatives, we would think, you know, we'll schedule a meeting in various communities. And culturally, or because of their documentation status, we would go and, you know, often I'd get the police chief to come with me, and really the police chief and I would be there by ourselves because people weren't coming. So then the question was, who in those communities can help us, particularly in the undocumented community? And we created our Rights Project, which stands for Reaching Immigrants and Gaining Trust. And we had discovered that really people who had an enormous amount of contact in those communities who were so trusted were English as second language tutors, because they were often the first people that members of the undocumented community would meet. They did so, and I had done that, some of that myself. It wasn't just teaching English. It's how do I get my kids in daycare? How do I find a dentist? It's everything. So, right, the Rights Project is really focused on doing the training for those tutors and others, whether in the faith community or in other places, who can do what we cannot do, which is gain access into the community. And very similar and related to that has become during the pandemic, you know, the concern, one of my primary concerns is obviously for the safety of kids. And, you know, DCF has taken a lot of bad press over the last few weeks for some things, but DCF has a pretty tough job on a good day. And we rely for DCF on people that are mandated reporters who see kids every day. I mean, much of what we learn about kids being abused comes from teachers, it comes from their dentist, it comes from their pediatrician, it comes from those people, none of whom saw kids during the pandemic. So, and remember, if you're being abused by somebody in your house, there's nothing worse than being locked up in your house for 14 months with your abuser. So a couple of things that we did to try to address that were, number one, who was seeing kids? So we have put together a statewide mandated reporter training, which anybody can take. It's on our website, it's free, you get a certificate, it's got great information. But we really spent a lot of time going out and talking to people, like, for instance, schools were giving out lunch and dinner to kids, breakfast and lunch to kids. So those people who were giving out the food, we got them to take that training. So, okay, they had a shorter interaction with kids, but at least they knew to be thinking about, should I make a report? Mm-hmm. We thought about people calling the police if they needed, for instance, a restraining order. Well, it's hard to do that if your abuser's on the other end of the couch. So, and, you know, when you're telling the story of, you know, my relationship's falling apart and I'm being abused or whatever, that's not something that really lends itself to, let me write an email. So we created a text line that you could, under the guise maybe of working, be able to send a text, and that would connect you live with an advocate in our office. So you could figure out either when to have a safe time to have a conversation, or at least have somebody responding in real time to all of that for you. So those are some of the things that the pandemic really forced us to change what we were doing. And I'm happy to talk a little bit more about the police reform and all of that. We did a lot of work around that statute. We're doing a lot of work. I filed a piece of legislation this session addressing the hate crime issue, one of the big problems with the hate crime statute right now. And it's was obviously a mistake, but it's a very significant mistake. Right now, for instance, if I were to come to your house and write some terrible ethnic or homophobic or whatever slur on your front door, I'm sure you would think that if the police found me, I would be punished for a hate crime, clearly a hate crime. Unless you happen to own that front door, I can't be charged with the hate crime. Because right now, the hate crime statute in Massachusetts says, if you damage the property owned by the person you're trying to intimidate. So if you rent that house, can't help you. If I write it on your neighbor's fence, so it's right in your face every morning, you don't own that fence. If I write it on the side, and here in Belmont, we just had an incident last week. If I write it on the side of a school building that faces your house, you don't own that school building. The other thing the statute doesn't do is, if the perpetrator gets convicted and he or she is ordered to pay to fix whatever they destroyed, that goes to the owner of the property. So if I painted something on your neighbor's fence and the perpetrator gets identified, they get convicted, and I'm ordered to pay $1,000 to presumably to repaint the fence, and your neighbor says, you know, I look at the back of the fence and the pandemic's been hard and I'm not spending the $1,000 on that paint job, nothing you can do about that. So the bill that we have filed would, number one, uncouple that fact that you have to own the property. And number two, if somebody gets restitution, they would have to use it to repair whatever had happened. It also particularly affects, especially in places where cities or towns might be a little bit strapped, and, you know, the graffiti that's on the side of the public pool near your house isn't their top priority. They would now have to repair that when they get that restitution. So that's a big change. It's also a piece of, and one of the things, and the mandatory sentence piece, you know, one of the other things that we changed about 2.5 years ago, and I'll finish with this is, but it's such a common thing. We discovered that when I started taking a really hard look at how we held people on bail, for instance, right? Some people have to be held on bail. They're too dangerous to be outside. We're afraid they'll take off and they'll never get to trial and all of that. But we had a lot of people that we were holding on bail, small amounts of cash, for instance, less than $500. And bail remains one of the few things you can't Venmo it, you can't put collateral up, it's cash. So if you sit in jail, like for instance, if you were sitting in jail through this pandemic because you couldn't come up with $500 and you didn't have anybody who come up with $500 for you, what else is probably true about you? You probably have an hourly wage job, which when you don't show up, you lose your job. You probably live in a pretty precarious housing situation where when you don't pay by the week or the month or whatever you're doing, you not only lose that housing situation, but probably the landlord pitches all your stuff. And most importantly, you probably don't have what most of us are fortunate enough to have. If you have kids, you don't have somebody who's taken over to take care of those kids. And your kids are going into DCF custody. And again, DCF does the best they can, but kids don't usually come out of DCF better for the experience. So when you finally got to the end of your case, where you might end up getting probation or doing whatever, your job was gone, your house was probably gone, maybe all your stuff was gone. And most importantly, you'd lost a big chunk of your kid's life. To get to where? So we changed our policy to say, if you were arrested and we weren't going to be looking for jail time at the end of your case, whatever you were charged with, if it wasn't a case where we were going to be looking for you to go serve jail time, we would just not ask for cash bail. And the big pushback on that was, right, a legitimate pushback. What's that going to do to public safety? So we took a hard look at what those offenses were. And the question was, no matter what the offense is, if you're the victim, you have a right to have that case go to trial. You can't do that if somebody disappears. So were people coming back? And what we saw in the first 6 months of that policy, the rate of people coming back went up by 0.5%. But by the end of 6 months, it had flattened right back out again. So people were coming back at the same rate that they were before, but they were coming back with whatever pieces of their life they had together before as well. So they'd been able to keep their job, they kept their house, they kept their kids, whatever. When you think about who's coming back, who's going to reoffend, one of the biggest indications of who will not reoffend is how much a person has to lose. We shouldn't be taking everything away from them, leaving them with nothing. So reoffending, oh, well, doesn't matter so much. I'm already down the rabbit hole. The more you can let somebody keep of their life, the less likely you are to see them again. So that's been a very dramatic change, but it's been a change that we've implemented in a way that there hasn't been a rash of public safety problems. It's the same with the pandemic. In February of last year, we met with our police chiefs and we said, for everybody's safety, unless somebody is violent in the moment when you see them, do not arrest them, summons them into court. We right now have reduced the number of people being taken into custody across the county by over 50%. I don't think anyone has read about a dramatic increase in crime on the street that means the wrong people are out there. It was safer for everybody in terms of the virus because you didn't have people together. For people struggling with their mental health during the pandemic, being locked up or locked up over the weekend doesn't make you better. And one of the things I don't ever want to lose from the pandemic is we're never going back. I mean, the good thing is police departments have now seen for over a year, people aren't complaining about their safety's been impacted. They have less problems in the jail. For a police officer taking somebody into custody on the street, especially when they often have substances on board or a mental health issue, it's not safe for anybody. You mean you can eliminate 50 or 60% of those encounters? That's to everybody's good. So I don't think we will ever change back to where we were. And that is one silver lining of all of this. So I know that's lots of information and you've all been very patient with us listening to lots of things. So I'm looking forward to some conversation and some questions. Okay.
Thank you so much, DA Ryan. Again, I think I thank you often in many, many areas. I am really personally really excited about the bill about the hate crimes. I think that's a big, big deal. I know that a lot of folks do rent. I rent, and so I think it's a big deal. So thank you. So we are going to open it up. Oh, I'll let Sarah do that because I'm just going to say thanks.
Well, I'll hop in because we've got a couple questions in the box. I'm going to start with Stephanie. So Stephanie says she has a question for both of our panelists and wanting to know how to have nuanced conversations with children about the police. And this obviously is going to look different depending on what your family looks like, but maybe it shouldn't. So if the both of you could talk a little bit about talking to children about the police in a nuanced manner.
Georgie, you want to start?
I will actually. When I do my my little encounter with families, I always, at the end of it, I always ask the kids about what it was like for the police to be in their house and did they know the name of the police officer? Usually they don't, which doesn't really surprise me, but I'll ask, was it a man officer? Was it a lady officer? Did they talk to you? You know, what did they say? Did they help? You know, what did they do when they were here? And so I sort of get a sense of kind of what the rapport was like. And for today, for example, I worked on a case this afternoon where I made initial contact with a mother of a 10-year-old who had been terrified and crying outdoors when the police showed up because the person in the rooming house was attacking his mom. And so I had a long conversation with her, and I've set up a Zoom call with her and the son later this week. But she said, she offered to me, she said, you know, I think he initially was pretty scared, but she said the officer sat on the curb with him and was talking to him and told him that the man couldn't come back, and that he was very happy about that. And he, you know, liked talking to the police officer. I thought, thank God, you know, like how nice that this officer took the opportunity to notice this child, spend time with him, send me the case so that I could follow up and, you know, probably do a lot of good for the police department and for this child. So it's always different. I mean, and sometimes, you know, the children will be really angry because they saw the police officer, you know, tussle around with their dad who was abusing mom and get dragged out in handcuffs, which is never a good thing. And I like to say that I've seen it happen many, many times in Chelsea where police officers in a scene like that know they're going to arrest somebody and will say to the person, listen, you know, you're going to be arrested. Let's do this outside. Let's not do this in front of your kid. And a good parent will say, yeah, good idea. Let's go out and you can handcuff me outside so the child doesn't need to see that. Sometimes they're like, oh yeah, well, watch this, you know, and they'll insist on having a scene and there'll be a tussle and people jumping on each other and handcuffing somebody by force. But whatever it is, those are very hard situations for children to have. And I'll often say to them, do you know what the job of the police is? And they'll say to arrest people or to shoot people. And I'll say, well, actually not. They've never shot somebody or killed somebody in the city when I've worked here for 20 something years. And they come to try to calm things down when things get, you know, scary, and their job is to make kids and families safe. That's their job. Say that things felt really scary here tonight and whatever, and do you know why the policeman might have taken your dad away tonight to give him kind of a timeout? And then the kid will say, well, yeah, I was hitting my mom or whatever. And so I don't try to convince them that the police are good, but I try to have a conversation with them about what happened. And I can say, you know, I'm really sorry that daddy got hurt. And I know you're really worried about him. Or sometimes if I know that the dad is arrested and is at the police station, you know, and the kid is worried about them, I'll ask them what they're worried about. And they might say, I'm worried, is he going to have food? Will he have a blanket? How long will he be there? Or I'll say, you know, would you like to make a picture for dad? And I'll bring it to him. And I've done that many times. We'll go back to the police station and I'll go have one of the officers go down to the cells with me and say, listen, I know this was a very tough night and your son is very worried about you and he made this picture for you. So I try to talk with them about that, and I always ask their experience and, you know, whether the police were nice to them. Sometimes the kids will write a note or make a picture for the police and I'll bring it back to them. Sometimes it's a complaint about something. Usually it's thank you for helping my family. It's always different depending on what the situation is and, you know, what the family is like, but it's always a conversation to be had. Definitely. Can't hear you.
Okay, sorry, I couldn't unmute myself. George is right as far as the kids who maybe have been in a situation. I think the harder conversation right now probably, and I assume is maybe what you're getting to, is talking about kids about everything that's on the news right now, 24/7. And I always think an interesting way to start those conversations is to ask the kids what they already know, you know, what they're seeing, what they know. Because I was just thinking yesterday, I was home and I had the TV on at some point, whatever, and then I got in the car. I mean, even if you're careful about what your kids are seeing and hearing, it's pretty impossible not to be seeing and hearing it. And that is a conversation that kids should be having. And I think it's always a good way to start by like, what have you heard or what are you thinking? Because I think you're usually surprised about how they've sized up what's going on or who's wrong or who's right. And I think that can lead to a pretty rich conversation about what's there. I think the other thing, and I see this all the time when we talk to parents about this, is I think it's hard for kids, especially younger kids. You know, every parent tells their kids, don't go places with strangers. And yet every year we have kids who get abducted by people because people think in some respect, kids think the stranger, the bad person, looks like a big scary monster person. And I think it's important to have conversations with kids about the people who look just like everybody else, have both good and bad things. And yes, you know, if our kids were lost, you want them to go find the person who's the police officer who would help them. And sometimes that same person can do things that aren't right either. And I think that's something that is important to teach kids, that just as they are a wonderful child and sometimes they do things that are wrong or naughty or whatever, the same is true with grown-ups, that you don't always know who might do something wrong. And I think that's an important safety thing for them. I think right now that's a conversation people have to be having with their kids, given what's going on in the country and what it really is impossible to protect them from. And especially because I think kids always have a lot more community, whatever their community is, conversations about these things than we think they're having.
Thank you so much. Let me find Stephanie. Stephanie, if you have follow-up questions, feel free to unmute yourself if you can. I'm trying to find the list.
Thank you. I can now unmute. Yeah, no, thank you both for that. That's really helpful. I mean, I think it's just something that I'm just not really sure how to proceed. My kids do know I'm, raising two white boys. And so I understand, I'm, very aware of the fact that the conversation that I have with my kids looks very different. And I think my children are also aware of the fact that everything they've seen, like you said, Ms. Ryan, people are often treated very different ways by the police. And, they understand at the level they can at ages 7 and 9 that they have a privilege because of how they look, that for the most, part of that privilege is being given the benefit of the doubt in most situations. And that privilege is not afforded to a lot of people of color. And we see that over and over and over every day. So it's complicated though, because I also don't want to obviously vilify all police officers. And there are some wonderful police officers in our community who've been helpers to them and involved in the school. And so I just, I'm not really asking anything else. I'm just babbling, but it's just something that I'm always thinking about is like, what is that message? What does that look like?
And that's the hard piece. And I think, one of the most striking examples recently, I think, was I have a very good friend who is a Black woman who is incredibly respected in her field, teaches at Harvard Law School. And she was talking about her 17-year-old daughter, who's incredibly accomplished. And I am a complete curmudgeon when I go to shop in Cambridge about paying the 5 or 10 cents for the bag. That drives me crazy. And she was talking about the fact that she has trained her daughter to always ask for that bag, to always buy the bag. Because despite the fact that this girl's incredibly accomplished and beautiful and, always very perfectly dressed and not anybody you would ever think to be stopped, but that is a fear that she has, that when she's with her, especially with her white friends, she would be the person singled out and stopped. I have a whole new perspective on the bag issue now, but I think that's something that a kid can understand. Like, what might somebody think about you doing that and how would you be treated? I mean, that's a pretty easy example. And something that is heartbreaking in the sense that a kid is living with that idea, but that's an experience even at their age they probably have going in. Every kid in town was buying candy in CVS today, of what that looks like differently and how the police might respond differently in that situation.
And I think you're absolutely right. That's a great, unfortunate example of what a lot of younger folks of color don't realize that they may have to do, because nobody's asking us for our degrees and we're not pulling out like a handbook on what we do. I think a very important thing to do is for white families to teach especially, I don't want to say especially sons, I should just say everyone, is that if they see something that doesn't seem right, to watch, to record. I'm not telling you to tell your kids to go and interrupt a police stop, but to take note of what's happening and to report it back to an adult that they trust, so that they can, figure it out from there. But teaching kids how to interrupt or to notice even those little things, I think is really important.
This is a good spot we have, and I'm happy to somehow get in the chat for you. We have a form that we distribute far and wide for people to be able to report things that they may see that they think are not right, even if they don't rise to the level of a crime or whatever. Because what always happens, and I think this is really sad, we will come out because, there's been graffiti or something happens and everybody says, well, this is just like what happened 2 months ago and what happened 3 weeks ago. And we never heard of any of those things. And I think that affects a community and makes a community less safe, and also makes people think no one does anything about anything when it's really that nothing is going to the top. So I'm happy to get that in the chat and I can technically figure that out and have it for people.
And we'll share it in an email to everyone because the chat will
Okay.
to me. Cynthia, I'm gonna ask you to unmute and ask one of your questions.
thank you, Georgia and Marianne. I have a question for either of you. You both have had a positive impact on improving training and changing policies. I'm wondering, what do you think are the biggest hindrances to more organizations taking these steps to make improvements, and why?
Go
First
ahead,
thing,
Gigi.
go ahead.
I think there's sort of a litany of reasons. I think, and some more easily recognized than others. I think sometimes it's the unpopularity of it. I think sometimes it is getting bogged down in the ambiguities of things, you know, because I mean, it's like the ICE situation, right? ICE might serve some actual good purpose. So you can make yourself crazy about like, well, is it better to not do this than do that? I think sometimes people get stuck in that maybe the middle ground or not doing anything is the best. I think it takes sort of a confidence in where you are and why you're there, and a belief that you will be able to get the stakeholders to your position. And I think that drilling down and actually having that certainty is hard for people to do. And I think the other, and because you can step out and you can go in the right direction. You don't actually get to lasting change unless you get stakeholders to come with you. And that requires a level of experience to be able to move it. I think the biggest piece is you have to figure out what motivates the other side and what piece of what you're doing will bring them there. I'll give you an example. When I was calling the police departments and saying, we're going to have a conviction integrity unit, we're going to look at these old cases or whatever. Trust me, joy did not ring through the land of like, why is she doing this? But so my calling them up and saying, you know, they might be innocent people in jail. Well, they don't think they put innocent people in jail. They didn't want to do that. They do want to hold people accountable. So the argument of, you know, if this person isn't here, doesn't that worry you that the right person is out there? That you've got to be able to get that psychology. And I will tell you, our very first conviction integrity case came to us from the detective who had investigated the case. So that takes sort of a strategy piece of why do they object to me, and what piece, because if you're on the right path, there should be some part of that fits with where they want, unless they're completely, you know, crazy and evil. There should be some piece of where they want to go that if you're going on the right path should speak to them as well. You know, people, I had lots, Middlesex is a largely fairly liberal county. There are parts of it that are much more conservative, shall we say. Again, I'm going to sue ICE. Joy did not ring through there. But if you were in that burning building and somebody didn't call because they were afraid of ICE, well, that's not going to be good for you. People were all of a sudden like, well, I don't want witnesses to have to go. I was like, well, that doesn't matter. ICE sends everybody. So it's that kind of, we call it level 4ing it, like taking it to the level of how does what they say become part of my argument? And that is a complicated piece to do.
I would like to add to that I think for children developmentally, it's very difficult for young children to appreciate the nuances of things, that they see things as good things and bad things. There are good guys and bad guys. And it takes some developmental maturity before kids can be old enough to see that there are many gray areas in life. And unfortunately, I think we live in a world that's a lot of gray areas. And I think, for example, when my program started, we were a hospital situation where we were social workers, which is kind of a much more democratic, egalitarian group of people. And we were trying to work with the police, which is a very hierarchical, male kind of place, completely different culturally. And to think about sort of merging those two together is mind-boggling. But I remember in our training 22 years ago down in New Haven, one of the police officers who was involved in the training said, you know, he said, what I've realized is that a police officer is a social worker of last resort. And so I think that once you realize that they have skills and they have power that can help, and that we have skills that can help them, and that there's a lot of gray area. It's not like they're the good guys and we're the bad guys, or we're the bad guys and they're the good guy, whatever it is. It's that if we work together and we sort of do some cross training and appreciate the fact that there's more than one way to do it, I think that's what makes a difference.
Awesome. Okay, so also from the chat, I'm going to read. So we've talked about developing police departments that commit to training and practices that are collaborative with community service providers. What kind of data should these departments be collecting in order to show that their efforts at collaboration are impactful? How do we know that things are better?
Oh, I'm excited to answer this question, because that is a question that is on my brain constantly. And you can go to our website or our Twitter and see that on June 8th and 9th, we are going to be sponsoring a 2-day inaugural data summit, because I'm a big believer in people pay for us to do our work. We should be showing what we do. So you can go on our website and you can see every piece of data about all of our cases from 2014 through 2020 as of 2 weeks ago. And we post that, you can see who goes to our diversion programs, who declines our diversion program. You can see that by race, you can see that by town, you can see that by everything, right? What is not clear to me are two things. I think that we should, first of all, use the data as well as we can. And I'm not always sure that people do that, us included. A lot of our data is data we collect because people ask us, so we collect it. But I'm not sure that we get everything out of it that we can. The second piece is, there also, I think, should be a place where we're looking at, I would like to do this. I'm thinking this would be a good thing. And I don't know whether that's true, and use the data use the data as our start place, rather than, okay, I have all this data and I gave it out. So what we're going to do on the 8th and 9th, the first day is going to be, we have essentially taken this idea of going across the country and the world to all the people who've been writing and teaching about this stuff and saying, here's your opportunity. We will give you literally hundreds of people. Come and tell us. Like, for instance, there is somebody who's done what I think is a pretty fascinating study about every DA's office should collect 7 pieces of information. No DA's office in the country collects all 7. And what you could do with that 7. So that person is coming. There's somebody who's going to come and talk about, I'm a big believer that resources are scarce and we should figure out what works, and we should do more of that. And we do a lot of things, everybody does. We do a lot of things that we're not sure why we do them. We're not sure they work, but we just keep doing them. and we should figure out, start doing those. The whole first day will be like TED Talks from all of these people who've been doing great things. You know, they've been writing and studying it and what's there. The second day is really looking at where we are in Massachusetts. And one of the big problems in Massachusetts is in state government, in the criminal justice system, we have tons of data where agencies, because of our networks and whatever, cannot talk to each other. And how can we make that better? And, you know, the answer in one piece is literally the DA's offices have figured out that if we spend $20 million, we could make our connections better. Well, there is not going to be $20 million for that. So how could we do that in a way that is feasible? So the second day will be a lot of practical stuff, a lot of things from the press about like what they really want to know, what they're looking for. So I invite everybody, and actually I'm going to have somebody put that invitation in the chat too, but I think it's going to be, I'm looking forward to learning a lot about what really is important, what we could do with things, and then trying to figure out some of the solutions for right here. Because there are things I see all the time that, you know, Arkansas is doing with their data that we could not do here. I'm not sure how that works. And I think we need to start figuring some of that out. So that was the perfect question.
I loved it too.
Sorry.
I think the problem with a program like mine is that at the beginning, people were saying, well, you really can't prove that it does any good, which is kind of true. I mean, it's like, because, you know, Georgia responded to this family and had this session and did some psychoeducation and did some assessment and made a couple of referrals and, you know, whatever, and everybody felt good. Doesn't mean that, you know, if that kid grows up to be a superstar, it was because I was there one time or two times. Or it doesn't mean that if that kid ended up being in prison, that I did a bad job. It's like a very difficult thing to measure when you have that kind of a thing. But we got a really brilliant idea a few years ago. And this was with collaboration with DCF. And we were, what I remember is when 22 years ago, when I started working with the Chelsea police with my two social work colleagues, almost the number of 51As that were filed by the police was pretty close to zero. They never filed. They never filed. And it wasn't because they were terrible people. It was because the police would zoom in on a scene. They would talk to all the adults to get the information that they needed for the report and find out what the heck happened, stepping over the kids like they were furniture. I'm being a little crazy, a little hyperbolic there, but they didn't talk to kids. They talked to the adults, got the information, and got the heck out of there so they could go to the next call. And I think that so as a result of our teaching and training and talking about the importance that they have in the lives of children who have no voices, was really important. And gradually we started measuring, you know, how many times in these cases the police would file or I would file, we would file. And so over time, it went exactly the other way. It's almost 100% now of the 51As that are filed in the cases are filed by the officers. And the reason that that's important is that in order to file a 51A, an officer, number one, has to notice the kids. Like, hey, I noticed it was a horrible domestic, but you know what? I noticed the kids. I noticed that they witnessed something. I noticed, you know, what was going on with them, or I talked to the kid. I got the kid's name and date of birth and I included it in the report. And I went above and beyond that and I filed a 51A, even if it was 2 o'clock in the morning and I had to call the hotline. I filed a 51A and I documented it in the police report. And to me, that says that there's some success of the program where 20 years later, and actually way less than 20 years later, the police officers were noticing children, paying attention to kids, talking to kids, and filing on behalf of children. So I say, maybe we can't prove, you know, that it made somebody a superstar or it made somebody a criminal, but we can certainly say that it changed the culture.
Awesome. So we're getting close to our end time, and I'm going to take one of the other questions in the chat and ask for each of you to say briefly what you think folks in the community can do to support change or drive positive change in the police departments in our communities. There's one or two things that you think of.
I think it's things like here in Belmont, having conversations. I think, you know, it doesn't do a whole lot of good if you're just spouting off everywhere about things and you don't actually come to the table and talk about it. And I think, you know, nobody, and it's always better to have those conversations when you're not in a heated situation. And nobody really wants to be doing a bad job. And it's important, I think, for people to hear from things. And maybe there's reasons, I think it's equally important if there's reasons, for instance, why whatever you think would be better can't happen, to at least know that and understand that and try to make changes. I mean, I think the civil service thing here in town has been a good thing for people to understand. Like, you can walk around and say people should hire different people, but if there's a civil service system and you don't understand they can't do that, you're just going to keep being frustrated about it. You may not like that that's what it is, and maybe you should work to get rid of it, but not knowing it, you just walk around being frustrated and unheard.
My 2 cents worth on this would be that I think that there is such tremendous value in police being involved with children, whether it's, you know, through after school programs or the program that Gladys had mentioned, sort of a pre-police academy kind of thing in the summer, where kids get to know the police and know their job and things like that. Anything that focuses on kids, reading to kids in school. Sometimes the officers will pick a day and they'll read a story in school. This is pre-COVID. But, you know, being involved with the kids in the community, because the kids are the future of any community, and kids grow up to want to run as far away as they can from the community or stay there. And if the community is a good place, they may stay there. So that's one thing. And I think the other thing is that it's an experience that I've been involved with for about the last 3 years, which is the fact that police departments themselves, I think, are paying more attention to the health and mental health of their police officers by providing services for trauma related to their job. Police officers are exposed to such horrific trauma on a daily basis, year by year by year, and their job. They see things that most people don't have to see that are horrifying. And they're very traumatized by a lot of things that happen to them. And I think now there's a focus on recognizing that. And I think that when police officers are taken care of by their police departments and they're made aware that their health and their mental health matters, and they get critical incident when they go through some horrible thing, they start to appreciate the fact that other people have trauma too, and that children have trauma, and that people in the community have trauma. So I think if you take care of the police officers as well, it helps the police officers to take care of the community.
Wow. Wow. I'm super impressed by all of the it's a lot of information. I've been taking notes and trying to like keep up. Thankfully it's recorded. I want to do a last call for any questions. We are wrapping up. I would like to again thank you, Georgia Green, and DA Marian Ryan, as well as my friend Gladys, for coming and sharing your time with us. I think it's super important to have the community have that access to everyone and the information that you share. So I'm really, really thankful. And I can tell you that on behalf of Communities Organized for Solidarity, as well as a lot of our community here in Belmont, we are incredibly, incredibly grateful that you took the time to come and speak to us. And how
I'm happy to be here. And if people have questions, they can always reach us or get them to you, and you can get them to us or whatever. Thank you all for coming out, for coming tonight and sitting and listening to all of this. I appreciate that.
Thanks for the good work you're doing in Belmont. They're very lucky to have you.
Oh, I'm lucky to be here. And you and Gladys in Chelsea too.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Good night. Be
Thank
well.
you so much to
everyone.
both of you.
Bye,
Thank
everybody.
you. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
You.